The climate is shifting. Ecosystems are under pressure, and the choices we make today will define tomorrow. There's no doubt that climate change is real and exists. We have had warnings for quite some time now, from high impact flooding to wildfires crossing the rural and urban interface. But how can we use our land more smartly? What solutions are out there? And what needs to be done to protect our planet, given that as a society we have placed so much demand on it? Across the planet, a quiet transformation is underway, shifting to renewable energy, rethinking how we farm, and learning once again to live in balance with nature. To understand more about the issues we face and the solutions emerging, I caught up with Tom Heap, broadcaster and author with a strong handle on climate change, the environment and rural affairs. How was it for you when you stumbled across this idea of land smart?
Well, it came about because an awful lot of people were talking about how we need to use our land for solving different problems that we face. Obviously there's the clear ones like space to grow food and space to live, but we're increasingly being talked about nature-based solutions. So that was land for growing energy, land for storing carbon, land for storing floodwater, obviously space for nature as well, land for recreation, land for growing materials, biofuels, all these kind of things. And my question was, do we have enough land to do this, or how do we need to manage our land to make sure we can have enough land to do it? And funnily enough, it ended up being quite timely, almost by chance, because just in the last month or so we've seen the government publish its land use framework. And so there was a sort of move to think how we're going to accommodate this pressure on our land. That's what I was thinking about, and I went out to find people who I thought were doing a smart job of it.
And there are quite a few people in the book that are doing a smart job of it, which is interesting. And before we delve into it, is climate change real? Does it exist? And are there still a proportion of climate deniers out there?
Climate change is absolutely real. You see it in the figures, you see it in the maps, you see it in the bald facts that we know burning emits carbon dioxide, we know carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, we know there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there was, and we know the temperature is going up. Now put those four things together and that's as obvious as if I put on a thicker jersey, I'm going to get hotter. Absolutely basic. And interestingly, I think a group of the population who really get this are actually farmers and land managers, because they're not seeing climate change come to them through social media or through the telly. They're seeing it on their land. They're seeing it on a monthly, yearly basis. They're seeing the changes. Of course, you do find some who will deny in any walk of life, but I'm struck, the two groups who I think really get climate change in here are farmers and insurers, because they're the other people who actually see the cost, see the impact day to day.
You say about insurers, we know that summer's again hotter, winter is getting wetter, but the impacts on the weather patterns are also sporadic and random. And when we're talking about land use tying into insurance, we have seen where areas have been built upon where they floodplains, and now insurance is going through the roof, and in some cases houses are uninsurable. And like the other element, Haysborough in Norfolk, where you have coastal erosion as a result of the climate, and it just screams to me that it does happen. And it is. It
seems obvious to me that climate change is making more of our land less habitable, either because it's actually falling into the sea, like you just described, in particularly parts of East Anglia and Lincolnshire, or because it's making it so vulnerable to natural disaster, be it fire or flood. And just on insurance, this might be too detailed a point, but actually there are some people who think the whole insurance business is actually masking that, because they are still giving insurance to people who live in those really frankly hostile places. And in parts of Australia they're now saying, hang on a minute, the climate is sending us a message here that these aren't really appropriate places to live. Maybe we should be not offering insurance to those anymore because it's just inappropriate.
And I quite like that you said the climate, Mother Nature is sending us plenty of warnings. When we see fires, especially in the urban interface that's wiping out homes, that hasn't happened previously. Why? Because the seasons are changing. And
well, you're presumably seeing this in your job, are you? I mean, you in your firefighting
Indeed.
job, you have to tackle those kind of fires.
Indeed, and you see fires occurring where they haven't previously, and at least the extent to which they did occur previously is nowhere near as the level and the damage that they are now. So there are early warnings. Well, I say early warnings. Is it a bit late, or do you think we are at the right time in the world to make a change?
I mean, there's no doubt. It's a bit like the old proverb about change. But the best time to tackle climate change would have been 25, 50 years ago. The second best time is now, and there is no doubt that there is a lot we can do now. And this isn't particularly a land use question, but one of the things that gives me enormous hope now is that the alternatives to burning stuff for our energy to underpin our civilization and our way of life are now there in the form of solar and wind and batteries, which are now cheap and available. And I'm aware that these things are intermittent, so storage is an issue. But it feels like a much more reliable and cheaper option than fossil fuels, especially given what we've seen in the last few months in the Middle East.
Indeed, and a lot of people had that mindset of, it's not bright enough in the UK for solar to work, but we know that's not the case.
Well, I just want to just a brief example of this, which I think is instructive. So I have my house roof, or actually sort of outbuilding roof, has the classic 4 kilowatt array of what you're allowed domestically of solar panels. That provides enough electricity to drive 2 electric cars for their annual mileage. I don't have 2 electric cars. My point is it generates enough electricity for 16,000 miles when the average driving in the UK is 8,000. Now just think about that in old money. That would have been like having had a oil well and a refinery in your garden. And now you can do that from your own roof. And that's in the UK. That's in Warwickshire.
In the Midlands.
Yeah. It is enormously potent stuff. Sure, it needs balancing. It's not, simple in some ways. But I often think the really instructive thing here is, imagine it was the other way around. Imagine we had solar and we plugged in our electric cars and someone said, I've got a great idea. There's this chemical we can dig out of the ground either from under the North Sea or in a really dodgy part of the world where they keep fighting wars. And we're going to bring it out of the ground. We're going to have to pump it out. It takes a lot of energy to do it. We're going to have to bring it over. We're going to put it in a tanker. We're going to put it there. We're going to then have special places where you can put it in your vehicle in order to move your vehicle. And then 3/4 of that energy is going to disappear as heat into the atmosphere anyway. How about that instead of electrics? I mean, people would think you're completely mad, wouldn't they?
Yeah. And we see a lot about the controversy that is caused by new developments of solar farms, of wind farms. Do you think people do have a valid argument in terms of saying that they look unsightly, that they don't belong in the countryside? Or is it a classic case of a NIMBY?
It's a little bit of both. I am actually sympathetic to some of the arguments that say we shouldn't be we should be careful about using our land for big solar farms. I mean, it comes up in this book, comes up in Land Smart, that I don't think we should be using our best agricultural land for solar. I do think we need to care more about growing food in this country rather than just importing it up from overseas and having an energy park and a wildlife park here. I don't think that's really solving global problems. Having said that, there are ways, and this comes back to the smart thing, you can mix solar with farming. So sheep farming you can do underneath and around solar panels. Quite a lot of people are doing it. If nature's and wildlife's your thing, the combination of wild meadows and panels has been very successfully done in places. And increasingly, and this is really interesting, as panels get cheaper, people are now mounting them vertically like a fence.
Okay.
North-south in the field, sun comes up one side, goes down the other, panels on both sides. And there, if it's a fence, it's not really taking land. You can grow arable crops in between it. And yes, it's not quite as efficient as the classic sort of point towards the sun, but if they're cheaper, it doesn't matter. You don't have to make absolute top dollar, especially if you're making another income from farming. So once again, if we think about it smartly, there are ways in which you can do two things on the same patch of land. And multi-functioning land is a big deal that I'm really interested in.
People have that perception that talking in terms of agriculture and food production, our farming communities, people think that farming, conservation, environment doesn't go hand in hand. But there's organisations out there, there's people out there working to bridge that gap. And do you feel we are now in a sort of a boundary of politeness and respect where the two are starting to engage and compromise, maybe?
Yeah, I think you make it's a really nicely used phrase, but I think it is the case that there used to be, if you like, two very much sort of separate camps. One was all about, high production, big machinery, lots of chemicals, and one was all about sort of, organic farming, love for worms in the soil, mushrooms, all that kind of thing. They are coming together, I think, in two ways. I think that the nature-friendly organic crowd are realising that actually yield matters. The amount of food we get from a given area of land matters. Meanwhile, for want of another word, the industrial farmers are realising that actually their soil can't support this going on forever in the same sort of way. Though also, the chemicals that they're relying on are getting really expensive, and that's before you come onto their pollution and climate change effects. And so they are sort of coming together, and the holy grail is can we manage our land in a way that in effect we rely on biology to give us our yield. That's the microbes of the soil, all the sort of soil life, rather than relying on chemistry, rather than relying on something out of a bottle. And the whole regenerative farming movement is really all about that. It's moving along that scale, hoping, and some people are showing it can be done, that we can have good yields with low chemical and fossil fuel based inputs. Where I'd say we're a bit more than beginning that journey, but I'd still say we're in the sort of foothills of that mountain.
And also, what struck me in the book as well, you're very good to actually acknowledge that chemicals did have their place once upon a time. We were feeding a growing nation, farmers.
Still today as well, actually. I mean, a lot of us wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for fertiliser.
And it serves with a time and a place. But again, going back to the analogy of fossil fuels, it does, because it worked then, doesn't mean it always has to be the case. And we should be more open to innovation.
Actually, I think removing fossil fuels out of electricity is one of the easier parts. Removing fossil fuels out of food will be harder. I don't think it's impossible. And there's for instance, there are some really interesting fertilizer companies who are going basing their work much more on food waste, our waste, agricultural waste, and producing a sort of pelletized fertilizer that doesn't require gas from Qatar, that is very good. And so I think there are beginning to be ways of doing that, but I think it's going to be one of the harder things to extract is oil and gas out of farming, in fact.
Solving climate change isn't always about pointing the finger at this stuff, heavy machinery, dust gas guzzling. We are now looking more at land use and soil health to capture emissions and reduce CO2 escaping into the atmosphere. There's a lot more projects that's out there that's fostering good farming practices, farming with nature and the climate in mind.
We haven't had pure production subsidies in England, at least, for many years. This is a subject that is devolved, so it's different in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. They each run their own regimes here. And I mean, I think I actually think we're in quite a subtle stage of this at the moment, because the government is sensitive, it comes back to this land smart thing. They're simultaneously very sensitive to the what they call food security, which is the amount of food coming from Britain, and they're sort of on the record of saying we don't want to reduce the amount of food we produce, whilst at the same time having concerns about the amount of nature on our land, and this idea that 30% of our land should be put to managed largely for wildlife. And there's something similar you were saying in Wales, whether it's woodland or other kind of wildlife management. This idea is, 30 by 30 was a phrase, 30% of our land managed principally for wildlife. That doesn't necessarily mean it's completely rewilded. It means there's sort of wildlife management within that 30%. I think they're realising this is hard to do, because what we can't do is just rewild a third of our land, because that doesn't really make sense in terms of food production if we're just going to import that food from overseas and end up cutting down rainforests or draining marshes in other parts of the world to grow our food. What have you gained? Nothing. So I think they are realising that this is a more complicated thing to do. But having said that, and this was true, especially when I there's a chapter in here where I talked to some hill farmers in Wales, and they are really smart farmers, and they're realising that they can produce pretty much as much food as previously off their land, while still giving parts of it back to nature, because that's not a very productive bit of the field, or it was very dangerous to work in because it was very steep, not very good for machinery. Whereas if I put more effort and intention into this part of my land, I can grow better grass, better clover, different breeds of sheep, da-da-da-da-da, and produce more food. So I think if you do it smartly, you can have this productivity and this greater yield and respect for nature. But it's hard to do. You need to work at it.
And people like those farmers in Wales have probably done a lot of trial and error projects of sort of making their own investigations and their own research and trials.
Trial and error is a really interesting point, because a lot of people say, you can, in order to do trial and error, you need to have a certain amount of money in the bank, because if you're absolutely on the sort of breadline when it comes to farming, it's very difficult to afford to experiment. So it's one of the things you'll often hear in farming, is that it's tough for farmers who are up against it to change their ways, because they can't afford to give something a go and get it wrong. I think what really annoys farmers is when they think the food growing element of their job is disrespected. That annoys them, and I get that, because that's what they've built a lot of their professional pride on. As we know, farming isn't just a profession, it's a sort of calling as well. It's much more than the 9 to 5. And if you're sort of throwing shade on the whole idea of food production, then you're going to put their backs up.
There is still time to change course. Through innovation, responsibility and respect for nature, a more sustainable future is within our reach.